Welcome to the first episode of Something Simple and Light with Tolu, Alao. In this episode, we're going to be exploring something really important and that will set the tone for all further conversations we will have in this season. This season is dedicated to aspiring operations managers within the FMCG space in Nigeria. And we're going to look at two critical aspects of the FMCG space within the Nigerian context. The first pillar here is the infrastructure challenges, while the second pillar is the regulatory environment that we are in. Let's start with the infrastructure challenges. For the infrastructure challenges, Nigeria's FMCG sector is saddled with issues around power, and power is such a critical element of the FMCG space. Most manufacturers, if not all, depend on one source of power or the other to be able to create products, and make finished goods. And it's so critical that power is sorted out in these industries. In fact, some manufacturers estimate that 50 to 60% of the total cost of production is spent on power. That's remarkable when you think about it. And this is why this is such a critical element of the FMCG space. And it's critical that operations managers understand this part of our business, right? How do we ensure that the power issue is sorted out? And we will talk about some of the solutions to these challenges, but that's the first part of infrastructure. The other part of infrastructure is our road networks. Because production happens in a certain location and you need to get these goods, across the country. So imagine you have a factory somewhere in the far northeast, right? And you have to distribute these products across Nigeria, the 36 states, plus FCT. How do you move your products easily? This is a challenge in the climb that we're in now because of poor road networks. Even where roads exist, the quality of the roads are not sufficient for heavy-duty vehicles, right? Your trucks, your 30-ton, 60-ton trucks to easily move around. So it becomes an issue moving your products, and making sure that it's available, across the country. And this is a huge challenge, for the FMCG space. The third challenge here, from an infrastructure point of view, is around storage, right? And this is more or less connected to power and the road network. For storage, right, you have production, you have perishable items, right, whether tomatoes, whether onions, you can think about it, your root crops like yam and all of that. And these are products that even if you are able to, produce them in a location and move them across the country, you need to be able to store them in such a way that they can last, seasons and out of seasons, right? And this is something that, significantly requires investment in cold storage, right? And electricity, right? To be able to preserve these products. And these are the infrastructure challenges that, FMCG, the major ones that FMCG players have to play with. On the regulatory side, navigating the complex regulatory maze of constantly changing policies, policies around product labeling, packaging material, all of that, and even for policies around, importing SUNCAP, imported materials, policies for, locally manufactured. This can be very complex and time consuming. And what usually happens is that except you have some form of dedicated resource, you're going to struggle to keep up, right? And so you need people that fully understand these policies, are dedicated to, going through this hurdle, because as difficult as it is required to show the Nigerian market that you are ready to compete and play in that space, right? And that you've done what is required to, show that you have the right standard and you are safe, for the Nigerian market to consume. So this is something that you really cannot avoid, right? You want to, ensure that you do them well and you proactively solve problems around, regulatory requirements. There are so many cases of manufacturers starting business, and because of one regulation or the other, they've had to close down shop because, they just could not keep up, right? And these are things that can, be a very serious headache for the typical operations manager in Nigeria. So what are some of the things that we can do, right, to solve some of these problems? let's start with the infrastructure. For the infrastructure, businesses that are resilient are beginning to invest in building their own infrastructure. Interesting, right? So you have companies investing heavily in their power generation, right? If it's getting gas generators, solar systems, and even some have no choice but to depend on diesel that is really expensive, right? But investing in your infrastructure is a significant way to manage this risk around power, right? And this is what makes your production more predictable. I've seen some businesses that do not rely at all on the grid just because it's just so inconsistent and not predictable. So to be able to have some form of predictability around power, companies are heavily investing in generating their own power, building power stations, and all of that. And what you can begin to also think about is the mix, the energy mix. Can you start mixing the use of gas with solar, and maybe even grid if you are able to, bear that risk there, right? And what some organizations and businesses are doing is still depending on grid, but having some form of backup power, right? So depending on grid plus something else, right? So whether grid plus diesel plus gas plus solar, right? And even planning production around, the supply of grid where it is possible to predict, right? Let's move to the next thing around road networks. Because of how bad the network roads are in the country, companies are significantly investing in having what we call, distribution hubs, right? So you have locations where you are able to transfer huge volumes of your items and store them just so that you don't have to, move a lot of materials at once, more frequently than you have to, right? So in the scenario where, for instance, you have a plant somewhere in Lagos, for instance, and you want to distribute across Nigeria, rather than distributing everything from Lagos, in those volumes, you distribute them to major, hubs across the country, probably in the main geopolitical zones, right? Northeast, northwest, south, and all of that. And then from there, your customers can, pick smaller volumes from such location, just as a means to, spread that risk. In also managing this risk around the road networks, companies are building strategic alliances and partners, right, with other logistics partners who can help them, who have the infrastructure in those locations and have the investments made already to pick up, and be the off-takers of their finished products, right? This is a significant strategy that, can be used, right, and all of that. And then the final part around storage for the infrastructure is around, investing in cold storage for items that are perishable, finding ways to preserve these things, like transforming the products into semi-finished forms, right, rather than retaining its natural form, just so that the product can, extend a bit longer, right? And these are some of the things that, you can begin to think about as an operations manager in the FMCG space. On the regulatory part, right, things that we're beginning to see is companies are building dedicated teams who are saddled with the responsibility of constantly monitoring these regulations, right? Whether you call them quality assurance teams, regulatory teams, who are constantly abreast of changing regulations and making their companies, comply early, right? Because the cost of non-compliance is way more, than whatever cost you spend, if you just comply early enough. So companies are constantly on the lookout to see what are the things they need to do and proactively taking those measures just so that they are, complying with the local regulation and they can keep doing business in those locations, right? I hope with all of this, you've been able to pick a few things, right? Whether it's on the infrastructure side or on the regulatory side, these are pillars that can make or mar your business, right? And as an operations manager that is saddled with the responsibility of making everything work, right? It's your responsibility to understand how all of this connects. See you in the next episode. Thank you for listening.